Welcome to the deep dive. As we were digging into the sources for today, one question kept coming up that, honestly, it really surprised us. It challenged so much of what we thought we knew about American history.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It was this. What if one of the largest slave rebellions in U.S. history wasn't, a standalone thing, just some isolated uprising?
Okay.
What if it was actually, inextricably linked to an indigenous war of resistance, a fight for sovereignty, for land?
Wow. Okay, yeah, that's big.
Right. And maybe even more important, why is that story, that huge interwoven story, why is it largely missing from our history books?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Exactly. So today, we're diving deep into the incredible, but often overlooked saga of the Black Seminoles.
Yeah.
They're also known as the Afro-Seminole people.
A really unique Afro-Indigenous group.
Totally unique.
Okay.
Forged in this crucible of fierce resistance against slavery, obviously, but also against the relentless U.S. colonial expansion. So our mission today is kind of twofold. We want to unpack these two central intertwined themes. First, how this powerful military and cultural alliance formed between Black Seminoles and Indigenous Seminoles.
An alliance that became, really the most formidable resistance the U.S. faced in the Southeast at the time.
The most formidable.
Yeah.
And second, we need to look at the systematic erasure of this history, how it got wiped from American curricula, from national memory.
And how that erasure is still impacting their descendants today, right now, in their struggles for identity, for rights. It's not just history.
Exactly. It's present day.
Yeah, and that's a powerful starting point, because what's really striking here, and what the sources we look at really hammer home, is that this isn't just some, forgotten footnote, something that slipped through the cracks.
Right. It wasn't an accident.
No, not at all. The sources call it a deliberately suppressed story. And think about what that means. This narrative, it fundamentally challenges how we usually understand slavery, resistance, even identity. Because it shows a major slave revolt wasn't isolated. It was deeply tied to an indigenous war for survival, for sovereignty. And the erasure, the forgetting, that wasn't passive. It wasn't just, we forgot. It was, and the sources use this phrase, an active political project designed quite intentionally to keep this simplified American myth going, the sanitized version of history.
Yeah, the one that leaves out the uncomfortable bits, the inconvenient alliances.
Precisely. And the consequences of that project, they're still playing out. You see them in court cases and social battles today. Real people fighting for their identity, their rights. Because of this historical erasure, it's still happening.
Wow. Okay, so to really get our heads around this incredible journey, this unique alliance, where do we start? We have to go back, right?
Way back to Spanish Florida. That's the surprising origin point, starting around the 1680s.
Spanish Florida. Okay, so you've got enslaved African individuals on British plantations, Carolinas, Georgia.
Desperate for freedom, risking everything.
And they head south to Florida, seeking refuge, seeking liberty in a Spanish colony, which sounds... Wow, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Spain had colonies. They had unfree labor, too.
It absolutely does sound counterintuitive. And that's why it's so crucial to understand Spain's angle here. Their policy of granting asylum wasn't, pure altruism, not even close.
Okay.
It was a really calculated geopolitical and military strategy, kind of a masterclass in colonial statecraft, actually.
Right. So what was the calculation?
Well, back in 1693, King Charles II of Spain issues this royal decree, basically freedom for any enslaved person who makes it to Florida and converts to Catholicism.
Okay, the conversion part is key.
Very key. But think about the dual purpose here for Spain. First, it's a direct hit against their rivals, the British colonies up north.
Oh, by draining their labor force.
Exactly. Siphoning off valuable enslaved labor, creating instability, making the British planters anxious and losing money. It's economic warfare, basically.
Gotcha. And the second purpose?
Build up Florida's defenses. Spain needed people to defend this strategically vital but really sparsely populated territory. Florida was the gateway to the Gulf, a crucial buffer zone.
So they create a loyal, armed populace out of these formerly enslaved people.
Precisely. Armed is the key word there. A loyal militia force ready to defend Spanish interests, especially against British attacks or slave raiders coming down from the north.
But this freedom wasn't absolute.
Definitely not. It was explicitly conditional. It was a tool of the state, not some inherent human right Spain suddenly recognized.
Right. You mentioned conversion. What else?
They had to swear allegiance to the Spanish crown. And they had to serve in the Spanish militia, often on the front lines.
So their freedom was tied up in these big European power struggles.
Completely entangled.
Yeah.
And that inherent precariousness, that dependence on which European power was up or down, that directly leads to conflict later, especially during the Seminole Wars. Because eventually, power shifts. The U.S. becomes dominant in the region. And unlike Spain, the U.S. had zero strategic interest in having an armed, free Black community on its border.
Quite the opposite, I imagine.
Exactly the opposite. For the U.S., these free Black communities weren't a strategic asset, they were a threat. A dangerous example, an unacceptable reality right next to their slaveholding states.
Which leads us right to Fort Mose, doesn't it? Established in 1738. Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, its full name.
That's the one, just north of St. Augustine. And it's truly groundbreaking. The first legally sanctioned free Black settlement in what's now the U.S.
Legally sanctioned by the Spanish crown.
Yes. And it wasn't just a village. It was designed as a military outpost, defended by its own free Black militia.
A militia made up of men whose freedom depended on defending that fort.
Exactly. They had a vital stake, as the sources say, in protecting themselves and their Spanish allies from British attacks, from slave catchers. Imagine that a free Black military force actively defending the Spanish crown that gave them conditional freedom. It just turns the usual narrative of the colonial South completely on its head.
And archaeology backs this up.
Yeah.
That it was a real functioning community.
Oh, absolutely. The digs there show evidence of a really complex, dynamic society. You see this incredible blending of African traditions, Spanish cultural stuff, even Native American practices. It was this unique melting pot, a living experiment in survival, resistance, building a new life.
Wow. And while this is happening, while Fort Mose is established and these free Black communities are forming, something else is going on. Indigenous groups are moving into Florida, too.
That's right. At the same time, you have various indigenous peoples, mostly Lower Creek folks from Georgia and Alabama, migrating south into Florida.
Why were they moving?
Similar reasons, in a way. Escaping conflict, but mostly escaping the relentless pressure from white settlers pushing onto their lands. They were being squeezed out.
And this is where the name Seminole comes from.
Exactly. The term itself tells the story. It likely comes from the Creek word for separatist, or maybe the Spanish word cimarron,
which means
wild or runaway. Same word used for escaped enslaved people sometimes, so you see the connection.
Yeah. Two groups of runaways, indigenous people fleeing settlers, African people fleeing slavery.
Finding common ground on this dynamic Florida frontier, finding a common cause, really, against shared oppressors, both seeking sanctuary, both resisting encroachment and enslavement. That shared plight created this incredibly powerful bond.
Okay, so this bond forms, this alliance, but then you have American observers and later historians looking at the relationship between the indigenous Seminoles and the Black Seminoles and calling it slavery.
Yes, that mischaracterization is so deeply problematic, and the sources are really clear on this.
Why? How is it different?
Fundamentally different from the brutal chattel slavery of the American South. It just wasn't the same thing at all.
Okay, break it down. How?
Well, first, Black Seminoles lived in their own autonomous villages. They had their own communities, often near Seminole towns, but distinct. They controlled their own labor, worked their own fields, raised their own crops.
And so they weren't property being forced to work someone else's land.
Not at all. They owned property, livestock, tools, farms. They grew corn, beans, rice, and critically, they were allowed to carry arms.
Which was unthinkable for enslaved people in the U.S. South.
Absolutely forbidden. An armed Black person was the ultimate nightmare for slaveholders. The fact that Black Seminoles were armed tells you volumes about their status within the Seminole Nation. It wasn't slavery.
So what was the obligation then, if any?
It was more like, well, scholars compare it to a kind of feudal vassalage or a tribute system.
Tribute, like paying taxes.
Sort of. They'd pay a portion of their annual harvest, maybe some corn, some livestock to Seminole chiefs in return. They got protection from the Seminole Nation. They got the benefits of the alliance. It was a reciprocal relationship built on mutual need and respect.
Not ownership.
Definitely not ownership. No buying, selling, inheriting of people. Sources describe it as benevolent or a patronage system, a cooperative agreement for survival, not human bondage.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black.
But the Americans insisted on calling it slavery. And that wasn't just, an innocent mistake.
No, you said it was political.
Deeply political. A deliberate act. Why? To invalidate their freedom, to create a justification, however twisted, for capturing them and forcing them back into actual slavery.
So they could say, look, they're just slaves anyway, we're just returning property.
Exactly. U.S. officials, they couldn't wrap their heads around this relationship, or maybe they refused to. There's this famous quote from an agent, Wiley Thompson, saying, "A Seminole would rather sell his child than sell his slave." But he totally missed the point. He didn't get that Black Seminoles weren't property like that. They were, in many ways, adopted kin, allies, essential members of the community in the fighting force.
It just didn't compute with the American racial hierarchy.
It was cognitive dissonance, sure, but it was also necessary for them to believe that, right? To uphold their own system. Acknowledging a free, armed, thriving Black society right on the border, that was an unacceptable existential threat to the whole institution of slavery down south.
It showed that another way was possible.
Precisely. So this intentional mislabeling, calling them slaves, it directly fuels the Seminole Wars. It becomes the excuse for the U.S. demanding their return to so-called legitimate owners, even though that ownership never truly existed in the American sense.
Okay, so out of this shared struggle, this alliance, you also get this incredible hybrid culture emerging, a blend of African, Indigenous, Spanish elements.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You see it in their language, their customs, their food, everything. It created something totally new and powerful.
Give us some examples. What did it actually look like, sound like?
Well, take language. Afro-Seminole Creole. Sometimes just called Afro-Seminole or Seminole Freedmen's English.
Okay.
The sources say it has strong roots in Gula, from the coasts of Carolina and Georgia, where many escaped from. But it's this rich linguistic tapestry, right? Woven with English, Spanish, bits of West African languages. It had its own unique grammar, its own vocabulary.
Like what? Any examples?
Sure. You might hear grammatical structures reflecting West African languages, like saying him been done gone for he had already gone, or using specific Gula words like tabby for a type of cement. It was the language of their unique identity, forged in resistance and adaptation.
Beyond language, customs.
A lot of blending there, too.
Yeah.
They adopted some Seminole clothing, like the colorful patchwork shirts, the moccasins, which were just practical for Florida life.
Makes sense.
But they held on to core African religious practices. The ring shout, for instance, that powerful circular worship with singing, clapping, that stayed. A direct link back to Africa.
And food.
Definitely. They kept their culinary traditions, especially rice dishes, which were central to West African diets. And interestingly, they actually introduced rice cultivation and preparation to the indigenous Seminoles.
Really? So the influence went both ways?
Absolutely. It wasn't just one group absorbing the other. It was a true exchange. You also see it in things like herbal medicine, a deep blending of African and Native American knowledge. It was a culture constantly evolving, preserving, creating something new.
So this cultural mix wasn't just like interesting anthropology. It made the Black Seminoles absolutely essential to the alliance, didn't it?
Indispensable is the word the sources often use. Their unique position, their blended experiences, gave them roles no one else could fill.
Like what?
Well, first off, interpreters and advisors. Crucial roles. Remember, many had escaped slavery, so they knew white American society firsthand. Its language, its customs, its deceptions.
They knew the enemy, so to speak.
In a way, yes. Many spoke English, some spoke Spanish too, so they were vital translators during treaty negotiations. Imagine Seminole chiefs trying to navigate those treacherous talks without someone they trusted who understood the nuances, the hidden meanings.
They could see through the official language.
Exactly. They offered strategic advice, helped the chiefs understand American intentions, anticipate tactics. They were intelligence assets, in a sense.
Okay, interpreters, advisors, what else?
Fierce warriors. Probably their most striking contribution. Think about it. They had experienced the absolute horror of chattel slavery.
So they knew what they were fighting against.
And what they were fighting for. Capture meant returning to that hell, maybe even worse. It meant their children being enslaved. So they fought with what the sources call a ferocity born of desperation.
Nothing left to lose, almost.
And everything to gain freedom.
Yeah.
U.S. military commanders. In their own reports, they consistently said the Black Seminoles were the most active and determined warriors they faced. Their commitment was total.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black. Okay, this naturally brings us to the Seminole Wars themselves. These weren't just border skirmishes. They were, like you said, existential fights for survival. The first Seminole War, 1817-1818. It wasn't accidental, was it? It had a specific target.
Absolutely not accidental. It was explicitly aimed at destroying those maroon communities in Florida, ending Florida's role as a sanctuary, a beacon of hope for enslaved people.
And Andrew Jackson was key here.
General Andrew Jackson, yeah. Later president. He marched into Florida, and his primary objective, stated quite clearly, was to eliminate the Negro fort.
This wasn't Fort Mose, right? A different place.
Different place, same idea, but perhaps even more formidable at that point. A powerful Black Seminole stronghold on the Apalachicola River. Heavily armed, defended by hundreds of Black Seminoles and their indigenous allies, its very existence terrified slaveholders.
And Jackson destroyed it.
Brutally. And that destruction, that whole campaign, directly paved the way for the U.S. to acquire Florida from Spain just a few years later.
Driven by slaveholder anxiety.
Absolutely. Southern slaveholders couldn't tolerate this armed, free Black presence on their border. It had to go. It was pure slavery politics driving expansion.
Then comes another turning point. The Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832. You said this was catastrophic.
Utterly catastrophic.
Yeah.
It was signed under extreme duress, coercion, only by a minority of Seminole chiefs. And it becomes the direct trigger for the much longer, bloodier Second Seminole War.
What were the terms that made it so bad?
Several things, all designed to just dismantle the alliance and their way of life. First, mandated removal of all Seminoles, Indigenous, and Black allies to Indian Territory. Oklahoma, basically.
Trail of Tears.
Part of that, yes.
Yeah.
But even worse for the Black Seminoles, the treaty put them under the legal authority of the Creek Nation once they got there.
And the Creek were?
A much larger nation, historical rivals in some ways, and crucially, fiercely pro-slavery. They practiced chattel slavery and had harsh slave codes. This was a disaster for the Black Seminoles who had lived freely or under that tribute system.
So removal and subjugation.
Exactly. But the absolute killer clause, the one that made armed resistance the only option for Black Seminoles, was the demand for the return of all fugitive slaves.
Meaning them. They would be classified as fugitives.
Precisely. Return them to their supposed former owners or their descendants. For Black Seminoles, this wasn't just a threat. It was a death sentence for their freedom, a guarantee of re-enslavement in the brutal Southern system.
So fighting was the only way to stay free.
Their only option. Signing that treaty meant signing away their lives, their children's lives. They had no choice but to fight.
And that fight exploded, didn't it?
Yeah.
Into what our sources call the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. The Great Slave Uprising, 1835 to 1838.
Yes, and it's astounding how little known this is. This wasn't just a spontaneous riot. It was coordinated, meticulously planned by Black Seminole leaders like John Caesar, Abraham, working closely with Seminole chiefs.
What do they do?
December 26, 1835, a coordinated attack. Black Seminoles, Indigenous Seminoles, and crucially, joined by hundreds of enslaved people rising up from the plantations nearby.
Hundreds joined them.
Yes. And together, they absolutely devastated Florida's sugar plantation economy. They destroyed 21 of the wealthiest plantations, burned the fields, the mills.
Wow, 21.
In a coordinated blow. This crippled the regional economy. It was a massive strike against the slaveholding power structure. And it showed terrifyingly for the U.S. just how powerful this alliance between Maroons and the enslaved population could be. The economic shockwaves were huge.
So huge that even U.S. generals had to admit what was really going on. You mentioned General Thomas Jessup.
Yeah, Jessup. Initially, he probably thought it was just another Indian war. But the reality on the ground forced him to see the truth. He famously declared, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war."
A Negro war. That's a stunning admission from a U.S. general at the time.
It really is. He recognized the core of the resistance, the driving force that was giving the U.S. military such a hard time was these Black fighters battling for their freedom.
And Jessup's quote really highlights something you said earlier. This wasn't two separate fights.
Exactly. Not parallel struggles. It was a single symbiotic struggle. Black Seminoles fighting for freedom from chains, Indigenous Seminoles fighting for land and sovereignty.
And they needed each other.
Critically. Neither could really win without the other. The Seminole chiefs understood. Lose their Black allies, and they lose their best warriors, their interpreters, their food producers. It would fatally weaken them. This interdependence, this unity, that was the real threat to the U.S. That's what they had to break.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black.
And this incredible struggle produced some truly remarkable leaders, figures whose stories just, they need to be told.
Like John Horse, also known as Juan Caballo.
Absolutely. A dominant figure, Afro-Seminole warrior, yes, but also a skilled diplomat and interpreter, eventually a chief. His leadership was crucial, especially in that later migration to Mexico we need to talk about. Real strategic genius.
And Abraham?
Hugely influential. A Black advisor to the main Seminole chief, Maconape. Abraham was a key strategist for that 1835 uprising, helped plan the plantation raids, recruited fighters, and he was a vital interpreter in negotiations. Maconape relied heavily on him.
John Caesar.
Another key Black Seminole leader, a sub-chief, a warrior. He personally led many of those devastating plantation raids. A real field commander in the rebellion.
What about Osceola? He's probably the most famous name from the Seminole Wars.
He is, yeah. A charismatic Muskogee Creek Seminole warrior. Not technically a chief by birth, but a powerful symbol of resistance. And crucially, he fiercely opposed re-enslaving free people.
Why? Was it personal for him?
Very personal. One of his wives was a Black Seminole woman, so the threat of re-enslavement hit close to home. His capture under a flag of truce became this huge scandal, even back then, and his alliance with Black leaders like Abraham was central to the war effort.
Any other key figures?
We should mention Cocuche, or Wildcat, a Seminole chief who later saw the writing on the wall and allied with John Horse for that joint migration to Mexico. And Maconape, the principal chief, who really depended on Abraham's counsel. It shows the deep trust and integration at the leadership level.
But despite all this resistance, this leadership, the wars ended badly for them.
Devastatingly. Ultimately, the U.S. military machine, the sheer numbers, the resources, it was too much. Over 4,000 Seminoles and Black Seminoles were forcibly removed, rounded up, marched west to Indian Territory.
The Trail of Tears again.
Enduring the same horrors, starvation, disease, freezing cold, death that befell the Cherokee and other removed tribes, it was a brutal, deliberate policy to break their spirit and take their land.
And even getting to Oklahoma wasn't the end of their troubles, was it? You mentioned the Creek Nation.
Right. That relocation treaty, putting them under Creek jurisdiction, that was another calculated blow, especially for the Black Seminoles.
Because the Creek practiced chattel slavery.
Exactly. They immediately imposed their harsh slave codes on the arriving Seminoles, specifically targeting the Black members. Stripped them of the right to bear arms, a right they'd always had in Florida. Stripped them of the right to own property. Threatened their autonomous communities.
So they went from freedom or quasi-freedom in Florida to facing re-enslavement under Creek law in Oklahoma.
It was a constant, terrifying danger. Pro-slavery Creek factions, along with slave catchers who sniffed opportunity, were constantly trying to kidnap Black Seminoles, especially women and children, to sell them south into brutal plantation slavery.
Could the Seminole leaders protect them, their former allies?
Tragically, Seminole leaders were now weakened, subjugated themselves under U.S. and Creek authority. Their ability to protect their Black allies was severely diminished. Some were perhaps unwilling, others simply unable. This led to a heartbreaking breakdown of that once powerful alliance. It was exactly what the U.S. government wanted to divide and conquer. Put the Black Seminoles in mortal danger, break the resistance.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black. So, facing this existential threat in Oklahoma, this betrayal, what did they do? Another incredible act of defiance, right? The migration to Mexico.
An absolutely audacious move. The mass escape from 1849 to 1850. Organized again by John Horse, the brilliant Black Seminole leader, working this time with the Seminole chief, Cocuche, Wildcat.
They decided Oklahoma wasn't safe. Mexico was the goal.
Mexico had abolished slavery years before. In 1829, it represented freedom. But imagine the journey. Hundreds of Black Seminoles, joined by some of their indigenous Seminole allies traveling south.
Through Texas. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
Extremely perilous, trekking across hundreds of miles of Texas frontier, which was hostile territory, facing dangers from settlers, from rangers, from slave catchers hot on their trail, determined to drag them back. They had to cross deserts, rivers.
It really hammers home that point you made earlier. Freedom wasn't a place. It was a constant journey.
Exactly, a constantly moving target. Think about their path. Carolinas to Florida, Florida to Oklahoma, Oklahoma now to Mexico. Generations pursuing safety, relentlessly hounded by the expanding U.S. slave empire and its influence. Their resilience is just staggering.
Did they make it? Did Mexico offer refuge?
They did make it, and Mexico, interestingly, welcomed them. They recognized their skill as fighters. The Mexican government granted them land in Nacimiento, in the state of Coahuila, northern Mexico.
In exchange for something.
Yes, in exchange for serving as a border patrol. protecting the Mexican frontier from raids by other groups like the Laipan Apaches and Comanches, and also from Texan filibusters. So they carved out a new free community there known as the Muskogos.
Muskogos, okay. A new start, finally.
For a time, yes. They had autonomy, land, freedom recognized by a national government. But then history takes another complex, almost paradoxical turn.
How so?
After about 2 decades in Mexico living as Muskogos, a group of these Black Seminoles agreed to return to the U.S. and serve the U.S. Army.
The same army that had forced their removal. Why would they do that?
It was a gamble. A desperate hope. They were recruited with promises of land grants back in the U.S., citizenship, recognition for their families. They hoped their service would finally secure the rights and the home that had been denied them for so long.
So this leads to the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts.
Exactly. Formally established in 1870, based mainly out of Fort Clark in Brackettville, Texas.
And they became legendary, didn't they?
Absolutely legendary. Renowned for their incredible tracking skills, their horsemanship, their fighting ability in the harsh terrain of West Texas. This was a small, elite unit, never more than about 50 men at a time.
And their combat record was perfect.
Unprecedented. They participated in something like 26 major campaigns against other native groups, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, fighting for the U.S. Army, and they never lost a single scout in combat. Not one.
That's unbelievable.
It's astonishing. And 4 of them, Adam Payne, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, John Ward, received the Medal of Honor for their bravery, the highest U.S. military decoration. An incredible distinction, especially for Black and Indigenous men in that era.
But there's a deep paradox here, isn't there?
A profound and tragic paradox. Here you have Black and Indigenous men hired by the government that displaced and betrayed them.
To fight against other Indigenous peoples who were also resisting U.S. expansion.
Precisely. It was a pragmatic choice for survival, maybe the only choice they felt they had. A desperate hope that the government would finally keep its word this time. It put them in this incredibly difficult middle ground.
Serving their oppressors to survive.
And serving them incredibly well. But it's also a stark example of that U.S. strategy. Manipulate conflicts between marginalized groups for colonial gain, exploit the Black Seminoles' desperation for land and security, use them against other tribes with the promise of land as leverage.
Leverage that they likely never intended to honor.
History suggests not. Once the Plains Wars were winding down, once the other tribes were subdued, the Scouts' utility diminished.
So what was daily life like for them at Fort Clark while they were serving?
They lived with their families in a settlement near the fort called the Camp, near Los Morris Creek. Simple homes, traditional jacal structures, adobe or wattle and daub. They maintained their distinct community, their culture, their language, even while depending on army rations and living under military oversight.
And the promises. The land.
Never materialized.
Yeah.
Another broken promise. Utter betrayal. Despite their incredible record, their loyalty, the medals of honor, the U.S. government reneged.
So when the wars ended,
the need for scouts decreased. The unit was officially disbanded in 1914, and then the final insult. The families were evicted from the Fort Clark Reservation.
Evicted. After everything.
Kicked off the land, forced to move into the nearby town of Brackettville with nothing, no land, no special status, just discarded. A really cruel end to that chapter of service.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black. But that wasn't the end of their story. Their resilience is just incredible. They endured. And today, there are vibrant descendant communities keeping that legacy alive.
Absolutely. Living proof that they refused to be erased. You see it clearly in Brackettville, Texas.
Where the Scouts ended up after being evicted.
Exactly. Descendants of the Scouts are still there, centered around the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery. That's where the 4 Medal of Honor recipients are buried, along with many other ancestors. It's sacred ground, a physical link to their history.
And there are organizations keeping the culture alive.
Yes, primarily the Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery Association, SISCA. They do crucial work preserving the culture, maintaining the cemetery, running the Seminole Indian Scout Museum out of the old historic Carver School building.
Wow.
And every September they hold Seminole Day. It's a huge reunion. Parades, church services, ceremonies. Descendants come from all over the country, California, Oklahoma, Florida. Back to Brackettville to honor their heritage, reconnect, keep the story alive. It's a powerful act of living history.
And then across the border in Mexico, the Muskogos.
Still there in Nacimiento, Coahuila, maintaining that unique culture, the blend of African-American, Seminole, Mexican traditions. It's a testament to that transnational identity forged in the escaped South.
Do they face challenges there?
They do, absolutely. Significant economic hardship is a major one, which often forces people to migrate, ironically, back to the U.S. for work. The community is remote, infrastructure is limited. And sadly, that unique Afro-Seminole Creole language we talked about, it's fading, mostly spoken now only by the elders. Preservation is urgent.
But culturally, they remain strong.
Very much so. A key event for them is Juneteenth. They've been celebrating it annually since the 19th century. Often, relatives from Brackettville travel down, reinforcing those cross-border ties.
What's their Juneteenth like?
It's vibrant. Traditional foods like sosk, that corn gruel, special spiritual songs called KPU, traditional dances. It's a powerful affirmation of freedom found outside the U.S. And importantly, after a long fight, the Mexican government officially recognized them as an Afro-Mexican community in 2017, acknowledging their distinct place.
And we can't forget the third major group, the freedmen in Oklahoma.
Absolutely not. Descendants of those who were removed to Indian Territory and stayed. They're mainly around Wewoka, the capital of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma.
And they're organized within the nation.
Yes, into two official freedmen bands, the Caesar Burner Band and the Dosar Barkus Band. They even have elected representatives on the nation's general council, which is significant. But this community is right at the heart of that ongoing, painful struggle for full citizenship.
The fight against exclusion by the Seminole Nation government itself.
Exactly. And what's fascinating, really moving, is seeing how these different communities, Texas, Mexico, Oklahoma, maintain their connections. These celebrations, Juneteenth in Mexico, Seminole Day in Texas, they aren't just parties. They're active forms of cultural resistance.
Resistance against forgetting, against exclusion.
Precisely. Maintaining a cohesive identity across this diaspora that was created by those forces of erasure and political exclusion. Juneteenth in Mexico says, we found freedom elsewhere. Seminole Day in Texas says, we remember our service even if you betrayed us. And the constant movement of people between Brackettville and Nacimiento, that demonstrates this living, breathing, transnational identity that defies modern borders. It reinforces the shared legacy of struggle, survival, and resilience.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black. Okay, so this resilience is undeniable, but it forces us back to that question of erasure. How did this happen? How is this history not just forgotten, but actively suppressed? Fabricated forgetting, you called it.
Yeah, and the sources suggest it really started during the Seminole Wars themselves, a deliberate distortion right from the beginning. Well, think about the politics. Pro-slavery politicians, the media of the time, they consciously framed the conflict as just an Indian problem.
Downplaying the Black resistance.
Completely obscuring the fact that it was fundamentally a war to protect and expand slavery by crushing this pocket of armed Black freedom. Even though military guys like Jessup knew it was a Black man's war, admitting that publicly. Too inconvenient, too dangerous for the pro-slavery narrative.
And the focus on figures like Osceola helped with that.
It did, in a way. Highlighting his charismatic resistance, and he was a powerful resistor, served, perhaps unintentionally sometimes, perhaps deliberately other times, to sideline the absolutely central role of his Black allies. It made the conflict seem simpler, more palatable to a nation built on slavery. It fit the Indian fighter trope better.
And the biggest casualty of this distortion seems to be the Great Slave Uprising itself, 1835-38. Largest in U.S. history yet.
Invisible. Almost completely invisible in mainstream accounts. It's staggering. For a long time, American historians tended to downplay all slave resistance, promoting this myth of the docile slave and the Black Seminole Rebellion. Because it was tied up with an Indian war, it was even easier to misfile, ignore, or just omit entirely. The narrative that no major revolts happened after Nat Turner in 1831, that narrative held sway for a long time.
Helped by censorship.
Absolutely. Helped by the silence from 19th century Southern sources, newspapers, official reports that simply refused to admit the scale of the rebellion or acknowledge they were being challenged, sometimes defeated, by armed Black fighters. Admitting that would shatter their whole ideology. So they constructed this silence, this deliberate forgetting, was crucial to maintaining the myths they needed.
And you're saying this isn't just old history. We see echoes today.
Clear, disturbing echoes. These modern curriculum wars in states like Florida, efforts to restrict teaching Black history, sanitize discussions of race, it's the exact same impulse. A direct continuation of that long history of erasure.
Like the Stop WOKE Act.
Yeah.
Or those curriculum standards saying slavery had personal benefits.
Exactly. It's the same desire to whitewash history, strip out the uncomfortable truths about oppression and resistance, maintain this clean narrative of American exceptionalism, banning AP African American history, trying to remove race from Rosa Parks' story. It's all part of the same pattern, using political power to control the historical narrative, just like in the 19th century.
So the Black Seminole erasure wasn't just incidental.
Not at all. It was foundational. Their true story had to be suppressed because it blew up the myths of manifest destiny, the myth of passive slaves, the myth of inherent Black Indigenous hostility, the curriculum battles today. They're just the latest skirmishes in a 150-year war over the memory of this specific, powerful rebellion.
Which brings us squarely to that ongoing struggle for citizenship in Oklahoma. The freedmen fighting for their rights, declaring, "We are Seminole."
Yes, and their fight goes back to another broken promise, the 1866 treaty.
After the Civil War.
Right. The U.S. made new treaties with the 5 tribes, including the Seminoles, who had mostly sided with the Confederacy. This treaty abolished slavery within the Seminole Nation, and it explicitly stated that the freedmen shall have and enjoy all the rights of Native citizens.
All the rights. That seems unambiguous.
Crystal clear. A legally binding promise of full equality, full citizenship.
But then came the Jaws roll. And blood quantum.
Decades later, yes. Early 20th century, the Dawes Act aimed to break up tribal lands, allot them to individuals. They created the Dawes Rolls to list who was eligible.
Just a bureaucratic list.
It became a weapon of exclusion. The enrollment officials, steeped in American racism, the one-drop rule, if someone had both African and Seminole ancestry, they were often listed only as freedmen. Their indigenous heritage just erased on paper, regardless of their family ties, their culture, how they lived.
And that bureaucratic decision from a century ago has modern consequences.
Devastating ones. In 2000, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma leadership voted to restrict tribal membership only to those who could prove descent from someone listed as Seminole by blood on that specific Dawes roll.
Which excluded.
It disenfranchised about 1,200 freedmen members who had previously been recognized, people whose ancestors were guaranteed rights by that 1866 treaty. Suddenly, based on that old racially biased roll, they were out.
So they've been fighting this ever since. Legally. Politically.
Constantly. Decades of struggle. There was a key lawsuit, Seminole Nation v. Norton, back in 2002. The ruling actually upheld freedmen membership and voting rights based on the treaty.
So they won.
Sort of. The nation didn't grant them full equal citizenship. Instead, they started issuing these ID cards, listing them as freedmen, often with 00 blood quantum, and giving them limited privileges, second-class citizenship, essentially.
Which means they lose out on real benefits.
Crucial federal and tribal resources, healthcare through Indian Health Service, housing assistance, educational programs, even incredibly, access to COVID-19 vaccines distributed through the nation during the pandemic. It has real life or death consequences.
It sounds like internalized colonialism. The nation using the colonizers' tools against its own people.
That's exactly what many scholars and activists call it. A tragic example of how colonial racial categories designed to divide and control get adopted by the colonized and used to perpetuate injustice within the community itself. It's not just about resources, it's a fight against the legacy of a racist bureaucratic decision made generations ago, a fight for belonging.
And the freedmen themselves are speaking out powerfully. You mentioned Leetta Osborne Sampson.
Yes, a freedmen representative on the Seminole General Council. She calls the nation's actions Jim Crow moves, a direct, powerful comparison. She says, to tell me I don't belong where I am, that's very disrespectful.
And she points to the treaty.
Always back to the 1866 treaty. She talks about her grandfather having it hanging on the wall. And she quotes it, "As long as the river flows and the grass grows, we are Seminole." And we're talking about the freedmen. It's this deep emotional connection to that promise, that identity, a fight for dignity.
So with this history being suppressed in official records, how is it being reclaimed? You mentioned the counter archive.
Exactly. For generations, because the official histories ignored them or distorted their story, Black Seminole communities relied on oral tradition, passed down stories, songs, memories. That became their archive, a living history held by the people.
And now there are efforts to formally document that.
Yes, thankfully. Academic programs, community projects are working to record these oral histories before the elders who hold them are gone. The Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida, for instance, has interviews specifically with Gullah Geechee and Black Seminole elders about traditions, the wars, migration.
Are researchers working directly with the communities?
Some are, yes. People like Mark Mallory doing doctoral research, collaborating with communities in Texas and Mexico, collecting stories in English, Spanish, even Afro-Seminole Creole, trying to bridge that gap between lived experience and historical accounts. The Seminole tribe of Florida's Atakaki Museum also has an oral history program, mainly focused on preserving history and language for their members.
What do these oral histories give us that written documents don't?
Everything, almost. The first-hand perspectives, the emotions, the details of daily life, of struggle. You hear from people like William Dub Warrior, a descendant of John Horse himself, his family stories about the flight to Mexico, about ancestors disappearing. That's history you won't find in any government file.
Or the Muskogee elders in Mexico.
Their perspectives on history, on their economic struggles, their complicated feelings about the U.S., the country their ancestors fled, but where many now seek work. Even older archives, like the WPA slave narratives from the 1930s, offer glimpses. The specific Seminole freedmen interviews are rare.
So for Black Seminoles, history isn't just in the past.
It's a living practice, as scholars say. The act of remembering, retelling stories, holding celebrations like Seminole Day or Juneteenth that is resistance, an ongoing act against erasure. That's why oral history is so vital here. It captures the narrative the way it's been preserved through voices carrying generations of truth.
If you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Tales of Black.
So wrapping this up, as we look back over everything we've discussed, it's just undeniable, isn't it? The Black Seminole Alliance was this incredibly powerful, unique force, born from this shared desperation for freedom.
And it posed a massive threat to the U.S., militarily, economically, but also ideologically.
Absolutely. Challenged the foundations of slavery, of colonial expansion, which is precisely why its history had to be suppressed. That erasure wasn't just incidental, it was necessary to maintain that simplified, sanitized American story, a deliberate political act.
And we're still seeing the fallout. The struggles of descendant communities today for citizenship in Oklahoma, economic survival in Mexico, historical recognition in Texas.
They aren't separate issues. They are the direct, continuous consequences of that history. Conflict, betrayal, erasure, playing out right now.
So what's the takeaway? What can be done for us, for institutions?
Well, several things come to mind based on the sources. For schools, educational institutions, we need to mandate inclusion of this story, especially the 1835-38 uprising. It needs to be in textbooks, curricula at all levels. It's fundamental U.S. history.
For the government.
Formal acknowledgement of the injustices, the broken promises to the Scouts, the failure to uphold the 1866 treaty. Agencies like the Bureau of Indian Affairs could, and arguably should, pressure the Seminole Nation to resolve the citizenship crisis based on treaty rights.
And for the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma itself.
The call from the freedmen and their allies is clear. Honor the 1866 treaty, restore full, equal citizenship, abandon the use of colonial blood quantum logic that divides the nation.
And for researchers.
Keep doing that collaborative oral history work. Prioritize it. Record those voices. Preserve that counter-archive before it's too late. Work with the communities.
It leaves you with a powerful thought, doesn't it? The story of the Black Seminoles. It really shows that freedom isn't some final destination you arrive at.
No, it's a relentless journey. Constant struggle.
Often forcing people to define their own nation, forge their own alliances, write their own history, especially when powerful forces try to erase them completely. It makes you wonder.
What else are we missing?
Yeah. What other truths about our past are we as a society still refusing to see, still actively suppressing? And what's the cost of that willful blindness, especially for the people living with that legacy every single day?
This story isn't over. Subscribe to carry it forward.